Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. On an incredibly busy news day, I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, we've got a lot to get through this evening.
Yeah, so much to get through, and all quite somber stories, really.
Yeah, lots of it's quite somber. Towards the end, it does get a little bit more ridiculous, but the first three stories definitely. Coming up tonight, former US President and Republican candidate Donald Trump has seen off a second assassination attempt. Keir Starmer has met with Italian Prime Minister Georgia Meloni to discuss irregular migration. They seem to be getting along very well. And The Guardian reveal an internal Labour plot against Jeremy Corbyn. So this is stuff from sort of 2017, 2018, but which we're learning more about now. And it involves some very key characters, people who are as close to Keir Starmer as you get. Former BBC newsreader Huw Edwards has been sentenced for accessing indecent images of children as young as 7. Edwards pled guilty to 3 charges of making indecent images of children after he was sent 41 illegal images on WhatsApp by Alex Williams, a convicted paedophile. The CPS have released a mugshot of 63-year-old Edwards, whose fall from grace has seen him go from one of the country's most well-known journalists to a convicted sex offender. But the sentence Edwards received today has caused some controversy, with many saying it is far too short, just 6 months. Moreover, the fact his sentence is suspended for 2 years means that providing he doesn't reoffend in that period, he won't see any jail time at all. Edwards has to now attend a program designed to stop him reoffending. The judge said that Edwards would have received 12 months in custody, as is standard for Category A image offences, but various elements of mitigation sort of affected this, brought that sentence down. Now, those mitigating factors included Edwards pleading guilty at the earliest possible point he could do so in July, and that the judge believes Edwards does not present a danger to children, that he believes Edwards can be rehabilitated, that he accepts Edwards' remorse is genuine, and that he accepts Edwards was suffering a mental health crisis. Now, when deciding on a sentence, the judge will have had to weigh to what extent Edwards actively solicited those illegal images. The most extreme videos received by Edwards show sexual acts between 2 children aged between 7 to 9 and 11 to 13, respectively. Now, about those images, the prosecutor said this. So he said, there was no direct response from Mr. Edwards to this video, so of these very young children, beyond it being marked as read. A week later, a number of attachments were sent, which included 2 Category B videos and 4 Category C still images comprising indecent images of children. On the 19th of February 2021, Alex Williams asked, "Is the stuff I'm sending too young for you?" The next response from Mr. Edwards is dated 22nd of February 2021 saying, "Don't send underage." So he said there, "Don't send underage." However, he had read the messages, or the messages came up as read, let's say. And the court heard that Huw Edwards had also told Williams on a different occasion, go on, when asked if he wanted naughty pics and vids of somebody described as young. Edwards had also written, quote, "Yes, kiss, kiss, kiss," when he was asked by Williams if he wanted sexual images of a person whose age could be discerned as being between 14 and 16. So the court judging it could be discerned as that. This afternoon, former Director of Public Prosecutions, Lord MacDonald, told Radio 4 that the punishment handed down to Edwards was in line with sentencing guidelines.
I mean, this actually looks fairly standard given the category of images that he had received. There are 3 categories set out in the sentencing guidelines. Category A, which is the most serious portrayal of penetration. Category B, which is portrayal of sexual activity but short of penetration. And Category C, which is simply an indecent image without any activity. Now, the majority of the images that Huw Edwards received seem to have fallen into Category C and Category B. I think there were some, but not many, in Category A. And in Category A, the range is from 6 months to 3 years. Category B, from a high-level community order to 18 months. And Category C, from medium-level community orders to 6 months. The guideline also sets out various mitigating factors which the court is obliged to take into account. No previous convictions, remorse, positive character, mental disorder, mental health issues, and so on, some of which seem to have been present in this case. So I think the sentence, as it's turned out, ghastly, although the details clearly are, is a pretty conventional sentence. And it wouldn't seem to me that Huw Edwards has been treated any differently to any other defendant finding himself in this situation, certainly given some of the psychiatric reports that were presented to the court.
So in terms of the mitigating circumstances taken into account when forming this sentence, I've no doubt many are reasonable, but this passage has raised eyebrows. So in the judge's final sentencing remarks, he quoted from a report by a consultant psychiatrist, which he said had influenced the sentence he gave to Edwards. So in those final sentencing remarks, they often say, this is the evidence that I found useful when coming to my judgment. And this is the quote that the judge includes from that report. Mr. Edwards is a complex individual with a psychologically challenging upbringing in which his relationship with his father was particularly challenging and probably damaging psychologically. The restrictive, puritanical, but often hypocritical background of growing up in the particular cultural milieu of South Wales with a father who was highly regarded and lauded outside the family, but was perceived as behaving monstrously within the family, created both an enduring cognitive dissonance and low self-esteem, compounded by a sense of being inferior by not getting into Oxford and going to Cardiff instead, and being therefore something of an outsider at the BBC. Ash, I mean, this is another one of those situations where in discussing this, we have to say we're not legal experts. I'm not an expert when it comes to what normal sentencing is for a situation such as this. I do think lots of people have sort of picked up on this comment about a mitigating factor being he was upset about not getting into Oxford. I mean, this man is 63, as seeming somewhat bizarre as something that the judge would take into account here.
Well, so I think there are two things that need to be separated. So one is this question about whether this was an unusually lenient sentence. And from what I understand from looking at the tweet thread from the secret barrister and having had a look at the sentencing guidelines myself, this isn't an unusually lenient sentence for offences of this nature. Now, it might be the case that even if it's not unusual, this isn't unduly lenient sentence for this kind of offence. I've been reading around the issue of rehabilitation for people who are convicted of sexual offences, whether they're direct sexual offences, for instance, sexual assault, or something which causes indirect forms of harm, such as possession of images of child sexual abuse. And there really is a sort of there's a range of opinion. And it's one of those things where I really, really can't make up my mind. So there's one school of thought which thinks that the length of the sentence doesn't really function as a deterrent. The length of a sentence has a function in the protection of society. This idea that it doesn't serve as a deterrent. What matters is the fear of getting caught and the likelihood of getting caught. So having a really high profile case like the Huw Edwards case might be considered in itself a deterrent. And then, of course, there's another school of thought which says, well, because these are offences which involve children and also the dissemination of images of child sexual abuse has a relationship to those acts of abuse being carried out, sometimes for the purpose of producing such images, that you have to have like a much more harshly punitive element. So it's not an unusually lenient sentence, but I think that it can be fairly considered an unduly lenient sentence. Like I said, I feel like I don't really know where I land, and I don't know where the body of evidence is on what is the most effective way of stopping someone from reoffending. Like I that's not something I feel I'm confident in offering an opinion on. And then there's this issue of what has been taken into account in mitigation. So there are aggravating factors, for instance, the age of some of the victims who were depicted in this imagery. So that was considered an aggravating factor, and the issue about Huw Edwards' mental health was considered a mitigating factor. As a man in your 60s and saying, oh, well, you felt like an outsider at the BBC because you didn't go to Oxford. Well, maybe that would be reasonable if you'd been consistently passed over for promotion at the BBC. But Huw Edwards was one of the most well-known, celebrated newsreaders and one of the most highly paid newsreaders in the entirety of the organisation. it doesn't make sense, or it doesn't match up with those elements of reality. That might be part of a story that he told himself. I mean, psychologically, we all have stories that we tell ourselves, and they don't always match up to what the rest of the world is seeing. But that's one thing which really doesn't stack up for me. And I think that this is the issue that lots of people have been wrestling with in different ways, which is if Huw Edwards wasn't famous and wasn't considered a person of really good standing because of his job at the BBC, would he have been treated differently by the criminal justice system? Right? Would there have been so much attention paid to his state of mind mentally and all of these other mitigating factors? I don't know. But I can say this for certain. I've never seen in mitigation for, violent offences, sexual offences, not getting into the uni of your choice taken into account for anyone. And it's difficult to imagine that had Huw Edwards not had all of that prestige from his position at the BBC, that kind of thing would be taken seriously.
You don't get a sort of random shoplifter who's sort of solicitor or barrister sort of says, well, Your Honour, they didn't get into Oxford, which is why they've resorted to behaviour such as this. I mean, the thing I found weird about this is because I can see as a psychiatrist why, because in a way, as a psychiatrist, it doesn't matter the objective fairness or unfairness of anything that's happened in someone's life. If it helps to explain why they are the way they are, then it's, you can't blame a psychiatrist for writing that down. What I found surprising here was that the judge specifically included that passage as having influenced his decision, which to me does seem like a mistake. Let's say I think people are kicking off about it, and I think with reasonable reason. As I say, I'm a bit like you, Ash. When it comes to situations such as this, I find it difficult to sort of say one way or another, this guy should go to jail for longer or X, Y, Z needs to happen. But this to me seems like a bit of a glaring. Is it an injustice? I think for that to be taken into account when someone is sentenced for a crime such as this, that probably is an injustice. With one candidate replaced at the last minute in a near-miss assassination attempt against another, the 2024 US presidential election was already setting out to be historically unprecedented. And then yesterday, this happened.
We are continuing our breaking news live coverage after the FBI says it is investigating what appears to be an attempted assassination attempt of former President Donald Trump. We are told the former president is safe after shots were fired in his vicinity while he was golfing at his club in West Palm Beach, Florida. That's just about a 15-minute drive from where his Mar-a-Lago club is in Palm Beach, Florida. Moments ago, we got an account from the Palm Beach Sheriff's Office detailing how all of this unfolded, Wolf, and it is quite stunning.
It's stunning and very detailed. In fact, very, very revealing. Law enforcement officials saying a person has been detained in connection with this incident that occurred at the Trump International Golf Club around 1:30 p.m. Eastern earlier this afternoon. U.S. Secret Service agents fired gunshots at the suspect, who they believe was armed and intended to target former President Trump.
So that's not one, but two assassination attempts which have now been mounted against former President Trump in the run-up to November's election. Now, this one was much less of a close call than the attack on Trump in July. Now, in July, of course, those gunshots were a few millimeters away from killing the former president. In this weekend's attack, the Secret Service were able to stop the suspect before Trump was in the line of fire, or so it seems. The sheriff of Palm Beach, where the attack took place, gave more details in a press conference.
In the bushes where this guy was is a AK-47 style rifle with a scope, two backpacks which were hung on the fence that had ceramic tile in them, and a GoPro, which he was going to take pictures of. What they do is they have an agent that jumps one hole ahead of time to where the president was at. And he was able to spot this rifle barrel sticking out of the fence and immediately engage that individual, at which time the individual took off.
So Trump has himself lavished praise on the Secret Service for their role. On Truth Social, he posted this: "I would like to thank everyone for your concern and well wishes. It was certainly an interesting day," which is sort of the mother of all understatements. Most importantly, I want to thank the US Secret Service, Sheriff Rick Bradshaw, and his Office of Brave and Dedicated Patriots, and all of law enforcement for the incredible job done today at Trump International in keeping me as the 45th President of the United States and Republican nominee in the upcoming presidential election safe. And then all in caps, the job done was absolutely outstanding. I am very proud to be an American. The intended assassination against Trump in July was somewhat difficult to place politically. In terms of the motivation of the suspect, it wasn't quite clear what the motive was, where they were coming from politically. In yesterday's attempt, the motive seems potentially more clear, or at least a potential motive seems more clear, we should say. 58-year-old Ryan Roof is a committed campaigner for arming Ukraine in its defense against Russia. And in 2023, he told the New York Times that he was seeking to recruit Afghan soldiers who had fled the Taliban to fight in Ukraine. Now, if you look on his Twitter, often this seems to be, somewhat on the border of delusion. Sort of he's atting lots of sort of powerful institutions and countries and saying, I can sort you out with loads of Afghan soldiers. So it's unclear how serious this guy was. But he was serious in his commitment because he did spend time in Ukraine, including in Kyiv in 2022, where he gave this interview to Newsweek.
To me, a lot of the other conflicts are gray, but this conflict is definitely black and white. This is about good versus evil. This is a storybook, any movie we've ever watched, this is definitely evil against good. We're battling a situation here where, the Ukrainians and the rest of the world are caring and kind and generous and unselfish and take care of one another. And it's just a matter of, we need to stand up for that. That is the most important thing in the world, is just to show human beings that we're kind and we're caring and that we take care of one another and that the world is united so that we feed each other and make sure that, we all move forward as one collective whole unit. So, we feel the pain of one country's failure and their conflicts, and we enjoy the successes of other countries that are doing good, and we all work together. And for some reason, Russia does not grasp this concept that we're all one unit.
So that was Newsweek Romania, not sort of the Newsweek site you're probably more used to seeing from the United States. It almost sounded quite sort of one world hippie there, saying we're all one world, we're all united, we're all connected. We all need to understand this. For some reason, Russia doesn't get that we're all one, united. It sounded kind of like he's like a pot smoker kind of thing. Clearly, though, he's not a pacifist. In terms of party politics, Roof's social media indicates he voted Trump in 2016. The guy, it seems that he's now gone on to try and assassinate. But CBS reported he voted in the 2024 Democratic primary, so he became disillusioned with Donald Trump. Ash, just the fact that this is our second story tonight, and it was also the BBC's second story this evening, which is an attempted assassination on a former president who is standing in a couple of months to be the next president. It's been just like, oh yeah, another assassination attempt against Donald Trump. Seems like what has become normal in American politics is just like what is going on? What can you say about this?
Well, look, I think that this is something which is bound to occur downstream of like the original sin of having a country which is armed to the hind teeth. Because we have no shortage of our own ideologically motivated eccentrics in this country. A big difference between us and America is that it's exceptionally difficult for them to get their hands on a gun. And I think that makes a significant difference, number one, the proliferation of guns. The second thing is that America, and this is like obviously not the most original point in the world that I'm about to make, is intensely polarized. And so when you've got a presidential election, in recent years between the Republicans and the Democrats, it's not just like, okay, well, there are these really big differences in how we want to govern the country, and these differences are meaningful. It's like an existential battle for America's future. So on the one hand, you've got, Kamala Harris being called a communist. She's not. Would that she was. The Democrats being accused of wanting infants to be murdered outside of the womb, after being born. these crazy lies about, Haitians and so on and so forth. So that's all going on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you've got a Democratic Party, which rightly or wrongly is saying that what's at stake for America is not just, 4 bad years under Trump, but American democracy as a whole, right? Saying that this guy is going to come in, he's going to get rid of not just the rights to bodily autonomy, the right to abortion, the right to access IVF, but he's serious about suspending the Constitution and potentially the democratic process going forward. And so the thing that I would say is this, which is if you were in America and you genuinely believed that those were the stakes on either side, all right? I don't really mind whether you're a Republican or a Democrat in this thought experiment, but you genuinely believe that what's at stake is whether or not your country can continue to exist. And you also have the not just the proliferation of guns, but a valorization of guns being this sort of bulwark against tyranny or attempted tyranny. Kind of makes sense to me that some eccentrics may come to the conclusion that assassination or attempted assassination is something that they want to do. That to me seems like a completely predictable conclusion to draw from all of these ingredients of intense polarization and proliferation of weapons, and also a valorization of using those weapons as a bulwark against tyranny.
The Democrats are in a bit of, well, I suppose they're not in a bind actually, because they seem to just keep doing what they're doing. But I suppose, especially after the first assassination attack, as I say, it's so strange that now it just seems to be like kind of normalized. But they're saying you're using such sort of totalizing language against Donald Trump. You're making this a high stakes election, which does obviously it does contribute to polarization. But it is the case that most of the stuff, obviously there was some stuff they said about Donald Trump that wasn't that true. Like lots of the Russia stuff seemed to be a little bit overdone. Although that said, he does seem to really like Vladimir Putin. But the stuff about him being a threat to democracy is very much fair enough. I mean, he did try and overturn an election. Whether or not you call those, what happened on January the 6th, sort of an attempted insurrection or sort of a riot of some headbangers. I mean, he clearly did want to overturn a democratic election result. And I think there's every danger that he would do that this time around as well. So, I suppose the Democrats can't really sort of have one hand tied behind their back where they're not allowed to say true stuff in case it leads to polarization, which in the context of a country flooded with guns does have the potential to lead to deadly political violence. I don't know, where do you stand on that?
Well, no, I suppose where I stand on it is that I agree with you, and I think that you're right. But as a consequence of that, it does make acts of violence targeting Trump or others associated with this project more likely. Like it just does, because that's the context that you're in, and it's bizarre. Bizarre is the wrong word. There is a conspicuous inconsistency, and on the one hand, saying this person is a threat to democracy. Like what you're looking at is potentially the rise of fascism, the suspension of every democratic and civil liberty that you have enjoyed for decades and decades in this country, and then saying violence is never the answer. We contest this only at the ballot box. Right? There's an inconsistency there, unless you think that fascism can only ever be opposed at the ballot box, right? And that's a position. But to take those both at the same time is a bit wacky.
Even though Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, I don't think many people, myself included, really believe he will. I don't think many people think that if Donald Trump wins the next election, American democracy will be over within 4 years' time, because I think most people think it's harder than that to do. But that he has an intention to overturn democracy is, I think, without doubt. Will he be able to? To me, it seems doubtful. He wasn't able to the first time, but we'll see. Keir Starmer has today been in Italy for talks with Prime Minister Georgia Meloni. At a press conference, Starmer praised Meloni's policies on irregular migration in the Mediterranean.
This is a problem across Europe for both of our countries in particular, but across Europe. As Director of Public Prosecutions in Britain some years ago, I saw the important work that can be done across borders on issues like counterterrorism. And I've never accepted, as we discussed, that we can't do the same with smuggling gangs. And now, of course, Italy has shown that we can. You've made remarkable progress working with countries along migration routes as equals to address the drivers of migration at source and to tackle the gangs. And as a result, irregular arrivals to Italy by sea are down 60% since 2022.
And there's potentially a degree of whitewashing there in Starmer's description of the deal signed by Italy with countries along migration routes. Italy's agreement with Libya, which predated Meloni, resulted in 5 years of EU-sponsored abuse. That's according to Amnesty International. That's because agreements with countries like Libya and Tunisia, they generally involved paying those governments, generally fairly undemocratic governments, vast amounts of money to take essentially any action necessary to stop migrants successfully crossing the Mediterranean and getting to Europe. So that would often involve intercepting boats. So a boat leaves off the coast of Tunisia and then the Tunisian Coast Guard sort of comes and turns it back. It would also involve locking migrants from sub-Saharan Africa in incredibly brutal detention camps. Often in those situations, they were subject to severe exploitation. Lots of this documented. Channel 4 News has done some great reports on it. It's a book, My Fourth Time We Drowned, which I really recommend reading. Really, really grim. What Meloni has added to this policy mix, though, so this is a policy that predates Meloni, which there's lots of consensus about, to be frank, in European capitals across the bloc. What Meloni has added to this policy mix is the criminalisation of NGOs who attempt to rescue migrants who do make it beyond the coasts of Libya or Tunisia, sort of into international waters or Italian waters. Now, under a new code implemented by her government, NGOs can face fines of between £10,000 to £50,000 if they do not follow rules which are essentially designed to limit boat rescues. They include, if you go out and rescue one boat and then another boat needs rescuing, you have to return the first lot of migrants you've rescued before you go to the second boat. So it's very transparently intended to make it harder to rescue people from the Mediterranean Sea. The Meloni-era policy, though, which has generated the most press during this visit, is the Italians' deal with Albania to process migrants there. Now, of course, this has generated headlines in this country because of its superficial similarity to the now scrapped Rwanda policy. There are some differences between the Rwanda policy and this Albania policy. When they're processed in Albania, if they're successful, they will get to go to Italy, which was not the case in Rwanda. They'd be processed in Rwanda and then stay in Rwanda. That was the Tories' plan. But Starmer was asked what he made of the Italians' Albania policy.
You say that you're interested in the Albania scheme. Can you be clear? How seriously are you looking at the prospect of sending migrants to other countries for their claims to be processed? And are you entirely comfortable with every aspect of Italy's approach, given the human rights concerns that have been expressed?
What we discussed today is a common challenge, which is irregular migration. And we discussed in particular law enforcement on the one side. How do you deal with this? By collaborating, cooperating, sharing data, intelligence, etc., but also the prevention piece. And that's why I had the new border security commander with me today at the coordination centre, so we could look at where we can do even more closely related work on enforcement, sharing our data, sharing our analysis, sharing our intelligence, and sharing our strategies. And in relation, we discussed the Albania arrangement, which isn't up and running yet, as you know, and therefore we don't yet know the outcome of it, but we discussed the concept of it, along with the prevention piece as well, because the numbers here, as I've said, have gone down quite significantly. That's actually not attributable, of course, to the Albania scheme, because that hasn't started. That, in my view, is more likely attributable to the work that the Prime Minister has done upstream, as it were, with some of the countries where migrants are coming from and the particular details and the approach that's been taken. I've always made the argument that preventing people leaving their country in the first place is far better than trying to deal with those that have arrived in any of our countries. So I was very interested in that. And in a sense, today was a return, if you like, to British pragmatism. We are pragmatists first and foremost. When we see a challenge, we discuss with our friends and allies the different approaches that are being taken, look at what works, and that's the approach that we've taken today, and it's been a very productive day.
It's an interesting sort of decision for Keir Starmer to go here. I mean, obviously the optics of him sort of standing next to this far-right leader and praising her for our migration policies might seem a little bit curious. I do think he's massively underplaying sort of the ethical problems with Meloni's policies, especially when he says keeping them in their country of origin, because the key things with the deals of the Libyans, or the deals with the Libyans and the Tunisians, is it wasn't Libyans and Tunisians really that they were stopping crossing the Mediterranean. It was people from other countries further south in Africa who were using those countries as transit countries. So it wasn't a case of we want to keep people, where they originally are, which, sounds nice enough. It was we want to essentially trap people before they can get as far as us. And that wouldn't work for Britain either, because the reason the EU can sign those deals with Tunisia and Libya is because they're poorer countries. I think the EU have given them about £800 million to do their dirty work, and they're also not particularly democratic countries. So they can lock people up in detention centres for a very long time, and you don't get much outrage. Obviously, we also lock people up in detention centres for a very long time, but they definitely get treated a lot worse in Libya than they do here, whatever problems we have in this country. But we couldn't do that with France, because France isn't a poor country that we can just give loads of cash. France, I think, would not take money to stop migrants crossing the channel, because they're as concerned about migration as we are. They have the same political sort of pressures that governments in Westminster do. Ash, what do you make of this trip? And I suppose Starmer lavishing praise really on Georgia Meloni.
One of the things that really struck me today, because I was talking about this on Politics Live, was that the Tory MP, the Labour MP, and the host were all united in talking about asylum seekers purely as criminals, and that they're a problem, that obviously we don't want them here. How can we best get rid of them? Right? That was the main imaginative frame for talking about this whole thing. And what got completely lost is the idea of asylum seekers, the majority of them are bound to have legitimate claims. That's not the same percentage from every single country, but the majority of asylum seekers as a whole are found to have legitimate claims. And the political incentives and what's seen as politically possible within the room that political parties have, it's so defined by that idea of that asylum seekers are a bad thing, or they're bad people, and we absolutely want to repel them. And that was the first thing that really leapt out to me about how this conversation was taking place. The second thing is that there was a lot of taking Italy at their word. So yes, it is true that this year compared to 2022, there has been a significant reduction in small boats crossings into Italy. That is definitely true. The bit which no one is talking about is that part of those deals with Tunisia and with Libya involved giving a far greater number of temporary working visas to workers from Tunisia and Morocco. In Italy's agriculture sector, North African workers are massively, massively overrepresented. And even the numbers that we have are probably an undercount, because many of them will be undocumented in some way or another. So what we've seen in Italy is something which isn't that dissimilar to something that we saw in the 2000s in this country, which is you make a big song and dance of we're going to have fewer asylum seekers, crack down on asylum seekers. But actually what you've done is you've turned asylum seekers, who are individuals who've got the potential to have their full rights, as workers and their civil liberties, as refugees, are being granted indefinite leave to remain. Instead, we just turn them into hyper-exploitable temporary workers who are often found in the sections of the economy where exploitation, poor conditions, underpay are rife. And I think that if you spoke to someone who was, who was just like a ordinary voter who was like, I want there to be fewer asylum seekers. If you went, okay, well, would you be happier if these asylum seekers were poorly paid workers contributing to wage suppression across a whole industry, which also impacts, British-born workers? They'd go, no, that's not what I want at all. And yet that's what Italy is doing. That's what we've previously done in this country. And so there's a sort of credulity on the part of the British political and media class when they're hearing about these headline figures from Italy. They're like, very, very successful at driving down small boats crossings. They don't look at the whole picture of what Italy's done. And that's before you get to the human rights concerns of offshoring, particularly in North Africa, or human rights abuses closer to home. The European Council on Refugees and Exiles found that minors, so children, are being detained within the immigration detention system in Italy, that people are being detained for far longer, that immigration detention has expanded because Meloni's government wants it to be a deterrent. These are all things which aren't really talked about, but certainly the bit they don't talk about is the increase of temporary working visas.
When Starmer talks about the spirit of British pragmatism, I think it's a bit ridiculous. But it is the case that every European capital you go to, they will be saying a similar thing. They'll be sort of giving it a different ideological flair sort of when they talk about it, but they're all saying similar things, even when, in the past or recently they might have had a different policy. So I know the Greens sort of in the German traffic light coalition, they had been sort of like, we need to increase the rights of migrants. Now their party is incredibly unpopular and they're sounding a lot more harsh than they ever did. Angela Merkel's CDU, which was sort of, the leading light when it came to being welcoming of refugees, is now saying there's too much migrant crime and these people can't come here anymore. Sweden now has net emigration. They were the country that by sort of per capita terms was the most welcoming of refugees. So it is the case that it's quite hard to argue in most European countries that we should be more welcoming, that it should be easier to get here. And so it is, I don't really see where this is going. And I suppose the thing that I think everyone does agree on, and I think is that they don't want more people crossing the Mediterranean or crossing the Channel because it's very dangerous and people will die. And I don't actually think anyone does have a solution to that, which doesn't involve, probably doing some nasty things along the way, right? Because if you give people safe routes, that's not going to stop people crossing the Channel unless you give everyone the right to come here that wants to come here, which is going to be completely politically unpalatable. Or you say, okay, well, like I suppose a compromise would be, something that I think Europe might end up with is saying, we will take X number of people via safe routes, but that means we're going to get even tougher in the Mediterranean Sea. Now, obviously, that's going to have terrible consequences. I'm not saying I support that, but I think I don't really see what the left are offering, which gives sort of this sense of control as well as compassion.
When you look at the displacement of people, which is being caused by climate change and will be caused by worsening climate change, right? We're talking about the displacement of hundreds of millions of people across borders. The idea that what you can have is effectively some kind of open border system in countries which are more protected from the impacts of climate change, richer countries, and also, this is the bit which is terribly unfair, the biggest contributors to historic carbon emissions. I don't think that's feasible. So what you're going to have to look at, I think, is one, yes, I do think you should have an expansion of safe and legal routes. That's not the same as open borders. And the second thing is that I think you're going to have to look at a model of development funding, which is quite different from the model we've got now, which is like so vulnerable to corruption. And maybe you're looking at something which, like, we talked about it maybe a year ago, which is something a bit more like pay to stay, right? You're paying people not to move. You're paying governments so that their citizens don't move. Because the idea that Europe can absorb, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of displaced climate refugees, that's not going to be possible. So what would a humane, fair and equitable approach look like? I think a combination of, yes, safe and legal routes, but also it's going to cost richer countries to pay people not to move. When part of the reason they're moving is because we have systematically underdeveloped and hindered their development economically.
And obviously, pay to stay would be very different from paying Libya to lock sub-Saharan Africans in detention centres so they can't cross the Mediterranean and then sort of exploiting them and often selling them into something which seems tantamount to slavery. Former political editor at The Guardian, Anushka Asfana, is publishing an insider account of how Keir Starmer rose to be Prime Minister, and it contains some interesting details about how his now closest political ally helped bring Jeremy Corbyn down. Morgan McSweeney is Keir Starmer's Director of Political Strategy in Downing Street, but in 2017 he was setting up an organisation called Labour Together. Now, Labour Together, this nice, fluffy name. The name suggests that it's positioning itself as an organisation hoping to move beyond Labour factionalism. Let's bring everyone together. In fact, though, its principal ambition was to remove Corbynism from the Labour Party. Now, Asfana writes this about a meeting held soon after the 2017 general election. McSweeney made clear his mission to those gathered in the Labour Croydon North MP Steve Reed's parliamentary office to move the Labour Party from the hard left when JC steps down as leader and to reconnect the Labour Party with the country and build a sustainable, winning electoral coalition. As Asfana makes clear, the 2017 election had scared people like McSweeney because it showed that far from being totally unelectable, Corbyn had a real chance of entering Downing Street one day. And Asfana says this: interestingly, in a SWOT analysis, so that's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, in a meeting, McSweeney claimed that one of the key problems the group might encounter was a Labour government, making explicit that his concerns was not whether Corbyn could win, but that if he were to become Prime Minister, it would prevent the renewal they were focused on, i.e., if Jeremy Corbyn were to get into power, then it might be harder to take over the Labour Party, right? Because if he's in government, then obviously they can't give him the sort of, he's completely unelectable thing because he would have got elected. And it's like, well, we want the party back. So ultimately, we'd prefer them to lose. And in terms of preferring them to lose, they put their money where their mouth is, because McSweeney and his colleagues, generally funded by hundreds of thousands of pounds from venture capitalists and businessmen, immediately got to work trying to undermine Corbyn's chances of winning any future election. So this is from Anushka Asfana again. After a few months working from a park bench, the group funded a small office in Vauxhall, and soon it reached out to former Labour advisors to work alongside them with a focus on online anti-Semitism. In an early review, they identified problem posts in hundreds of Facebook groups with links to either the party or left-wing politics. And that's amazing. Either the party or left-wing politics. That's so vague in terms of its connection to the leadership. Some of those were aimed at Labour's female Jewish MPs. She writes, they then farmed out the posts they uncovered to journalists who were themselves reporting on rising evidence of anti-Semitism on the left, together with a row over whether the party would adopt all the examples linked to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. The scandal was becoming increasingly destabilizing for Corbyn. When you scan that, you can say, oh, this is not uncovering a conspiracy because these were people that were worried about the direction of the Labour Party. Maybe they were worried about the direction of the Labour Party because they saw it as containing anti-Semitism, and then they did everything in their power to sort of shine a light on that anti-Semitism. The context that misses is how ridiculous the media narrative was at this period of time. So what you'd get is the Sunday Times, you get all these different newspapers doing these huge, endless splashes saying there are so many genocidal racists in these Facebook groups associated with Jeremy Corbyn. And it turns out these Facebook groups have absolutely nothing to do with Jeremy Corbyn. You've got, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who've expressed some interest in left-wing politics. And you can make a months-long news cycle when about 500 of them post weird things online. Or racist things online, indeed, right? That shouldn't really be a news cycle when you're talking about 1 million people. They've got nothing to do with anyone in power. But this was the kind of thing, it seems, that these guys were feeding to the right-wing press. And here's a reminder of the result of anti-Corbyn activists feeding Facebook posts to the right-wing press. This was Owen Jones going to head-to-head with a BBC journalist after the Sunday Times had published a front-page report on what a small number of Labour supporters with no connection to the Labour leader had said online.
You know what's happening. You know what that front page splash is all about. I'll give you an example. That Sunday Times splash, because you were leading on it the last hour. I did watch, by the way. And
I'm not disputing what may have been done earlier. What I'm saying to you is, isn't the story of the Sunday Times, presumably if the Sunday Times had found any evidence that linked an individual to it, they would have gone on that. They didn't find that. What they did is went on Facebook groups with tens of thousands of members, with hundreds of thousands of posts, millions probably of comments cumulatively, found despicable racist and anti-Semitic comments, then tried to link that to the fact that there were people within the leader's office who are the most committed anti-racists I've probably ever met. Look, I've got an example here, just to show how these splashes work. This so-called journalism, okay? Where's your camera? This is Conservatives Against the EU. It's a Facebook group. It is full of the most despicable racism I've ever seen. Presumably the Conservative Party would reject it.
About Gina Miller, for example, F off you foreigner, telling them to go back to your homeland.
Fine.
The most despicable racism. You're not making that. Why isn't that? Why is that?
Because presumably Labour is the story at the moment.
Labour is the story at the moment. Now, Ash, when I heard that, because I kind of memory hold some of this, the amount of times sort of where there'd be this sort of right-wing moral panic about what a few people had said on Facebook. And then you say, well, the Tories, the same. And say, well, Labour are the story at the moment. The Tories were never the story. The reason the Tories were never the story is because there weren't people like Morgan McSweeney sort of obsessively feeding these non-stories really to the right-wing press.
Why Labour was unique is because you had Labour insiders and apparatchiks, many of whom were already very close to journalists. Some of these had been quite senior political advisors to, former cabinet ministers and the like, who had these really, really cozy relationships with journalists, where there was a set of shared incentives, where the journalists were annoyed at the rise of the left because it meant that their contacts were useless now. They were ideologically opposed to the rise of the left. And then you also had all of these people who are factional operators who absolutely couldn't stand the idea that they might be out of a job, and who I think were the only people within the borders of Great Britain and Northern Ireland who were like, yeah, Blairism's good. That's still a solid approach for, managing government and the economy, despite it being, almost completely discredited. So you had these two things in alignment, and journalists were so angry any time you would point out, like, no, you are acting ideologically. You aren't being impartial. This is Labour of the story because you're a journalist and you've made it the story. If you wanted to, you could look at Tory party Islamophobia. You could look at Tory party racism. There were many times where I said to journalists, well, I was racially abused by this Conservative councillor. It's not leading the Today programme. Whereas had that been a Labour Party councillor, particularly one from the left, it would have been all over the news. And they'd be like, oh yeah, well, that's just not the story. And then they would talk about the story as if it exists outside of their own media practice, right? Which is completely, it's beyond belief. The one thing that I would say from having read that Anushka Asthana piece, and this isn't about morality, it's about strategy, is I think I look back on those years and I think about all the ways in which I made the wrong strategic call, or I lobbied for something that was unstrategic, or I wasn't focused on what would be more conducive to the goal of winning the 2019 election. And I can give you some examples of this. And this is really me taking a look at my own errors in thinking. So when it got to 2019, I started writing quite publicly about Labour needing to shift to a more Remain position. All right. A more, pro-second referendum kind of position. And I tried to argue it in various different ways. Now, that was done in good faith, right? I thought that would be the best way to resolve the Brexit impasse at the time, but it was also a product of my own biases. What those biases were that university educated, live in a city, everyone I know voted Remain. And so I was blinded, or perhaps didn't want to see the reality of the political arithmetic in front of us, which is that 52% of the electorate in 2016 voted for Brexit. There were more Leave voting seats for Labour to lose than there were Remain voting seats for Labour to gain. And maybe if I'd been more strategic, the thing I would have been arguing would have been different. Another area of being completely unstrategic was, again, lead up to 2019. A lot of what I was interested in covering was how could you get the leadership to take on more left-wing positions, whether that was on immigration or abolishing private schools or anything. And these are all things which morally I still think are right. Strategically, they weren't right. Because those were all things about, well, how should Labour govern, right? And advancing the sort of left-wing cause within, a proposed manifesto. The right focus, the strategic focus, would have been, what will it take for Labour to win in 2019? And when I read that piece by Anushka Asthana, I looked at the view, the sort of disposition of Morgan McSweeney. And while morally and politically I object to every single thing Labour together were doing, they had a tunnel visioned sense of strategic purpose, which I think during those same years the left often lacked. And when I say the left, I'm very much including myself in that.
Yeah, I agree. I'll include myself in that as well, Ash. No, I agree. I actually thought it was quite interesting when they were saying, Morgan McSweeney was reassured when he saw Jeremy Corbyn at Glastonbury with the whole Jeremy Corbyn thing, because he was saying that after the election, after the 2017 election, when Labour got kind of close to power, Corbyn could have sort of started taking it really serious that he was going to be the next prime minister, and appealing to the people who didn't quite vote for him in that election, but instead he sort of went to his happy place and sort of celebrated with the people who had voted for him. I think there is some truth to that. And I think that is, that did come out in that 2019 conference, which I do think was a bit of a disaster, which was sort of like the left a bit high on its own supply, making the manifesto as radical as it could possibly be on every single issue. Obviously, lots of it didn't actually feed into the manifesto, but sort of had set its task as how to make this the most radical policy platform ever when, Labour were behind in the polls. And it was, it was in retrospect, it was obviously heading for disaster. But as I say, I don't say this is a problem with other people. We were present and also involved, to take a phraseology from the Corbyn years. If you want a sure sign that Keir Starmer's honeymoon is already over, it's this. The corporate media has finally decided it's worth reporting on his penchant for accepting valuable gifts from corporate donors. This has, of course, been a topic of reportage in the independent press for a while. In August last year, Open Democracy reported that in his first 4 years as opposition leader, Starmer accepted more freebies than all Labour leaders since 1997 combined. The freebies included days at the races, hospitality at Chelsea and Tottenham matches, tickets to an Adele gig, and 2 separate Coldplay concerts. The junkets were paid for by multimillionaires, gambling giants, online shopping apps, and construction companies. We, of course, picked up that story. But while Starmer was the man of the moment in Westminster, outside independent media, the story just didn't really catch on. Well, this weekend, that's changed. The Sunday Times had a big splash on Starmer breaking rules by not declaring clothes bought for his wife by multimillionaire Lord Ali. So the paper reports this. Ali, the former chairman of the online fashion retailer ASOS, whose wealth is estimated at £200 million, is Starmer's biggest personal donor. This year, he has given the Labour leader £18,000 worth of work clothes and several pairs of glasses. He also spent £20,000 on accommodation for Starmer during the election and a similar sum on private office costs. Those were declared, but the clothes given to Lady Starmer, it is thought before and after her husband entered Downing Street in July, were not. She received deliveries around the time Ali was embroiled in a cash for access row. The Sunday Times revealed he had a number 10 security pass and used it to entertain donors in the garden of Downing Street. Labour headquarters has helped to organise the delivery of the goods for Lady Starmer. Details of the arrangement were known only to a tiny circle of trusted advisors. The clothes bought for Lady Starmer weren't quite as expensive as what her husband has been wearing, so the bill for her clothes covered by Lord Ali comes to £5,000, and it was £18,000 for her husband. Speaking on Sunday, David Lammy has suggested that there's nothing to see here.
This is not an issue of transparency. He is attempting to be transparent. The truth is in our system, I've just come back from the United States, where US presidents and first ladies have a huge budget paid for by the taxpayer so that they look their best on behalf of the US people. We don't have that system over here. The truth is that successive prime ministers, unless you're a billionaire like the last one, do rely on donations, political donations, so they can look their best, both in the hope of representing the country if you're in the opposition, or indeed as Prime Minister. That's the situation.
But with respect, the Starmers aren't exactly broke. I mean, he had big senior jobs, was paid very well, paid very well as Prime Minister.
I'm not suggesting the Prime Minister is broke, and of course we can have that debate. But the point is this, that successive Prime Ministers want to look their best and their partners for the country. That is what lies behind this.
So Starmer accepted thousands of pounds for his wife's dresses and his own for us, the British people. He simply wanted to look good for Britain, for us, on the world stage. How moving. What sacrifice. Oh no, I'll have to accept all of this lovely money for these lovely gifts just so I can look good for my people, to represent them well. We can assume that's also why he accepted junkets to the races, to Adele and Coldplay concerts, and to VIP boxes at Tottenham and Arsenal. It was all for us. He had to be there to represent us, the humble British people. On BBC Politics Live today, Ash Sarkar wasn't impressed.
There's no such thing as a free lunch. And if what you expect me to believe is that Lord Ali was just from the goodness of his own heart, helping her out with some wardrobe issues, and that's all there was to it. I mean, really, like, do you have a bridge you'd like to sell me as well? I just think it's ridiculous.
When it was in return for it, well, just show me.
It's
that is the question you want to answer. That's the question.
The thing about influence and having the ear of a powerful politician is that you can't always measure these things. But that's why donors do this kind of thing. And I think that there is a particular problem with Keir Starmer here, because on the one hand, when he was in opposition, him and Angela Rayner went gangbusters. When Boris Johnson had a Tory donor pay for some expensive wallpaper, they said, well, you earn all this money, you can buy your own wallpaper. And we all went, yeah, that's a fair point. Now, when we're saying, well, you earn all this money, can't you buy your wife a dress? It's like, oh, well, no, Lady Starmer, she works in the NHS. It's beyond belief. And like I said, problem with Keir Starmer, he has accepted more freebies as leader of the opposition than every other Labour leader combined since 1997, right? So if he's doing worse than Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Ed Miliband and Jeremy Corbyn on that measure, they could go without all those freebies. Why can't he?
Very effectively put, Ash. We've been talking about this story for a while, that Keir Starmer seems to be very comfortable accepting gifts, indeed more comfortable than any leader. I think, since they've been sort of recording this kind of stuff, or at least since 1997, that's that. Or since 1997 combined, wasn't it? That was sort of the stat there that was quite shocking. And we've been saying, look, so long as he's in the lobby's good books, they might mention this in passing, but it's not going to become the story, right? Because it only becomes the story when they turn against the guy. Are we now seeing sort of the media saying, we're not sure about this guy anymore. All of this stuff that we've known for ages, now let's make a really big fuss about it. Is that sort of that ball in motion?
Well, I think so. I mean, you've seen it with the collapse of his personal popularity ratings. It's worth comparing Keir Starmer to Tony Blair. So Tony Blair, really, for the first 3 years he was in office, enjoyed net positive popularity ratings. Now, the personal popularity of Keir Starmer was always lower, coming into the election and immediately following. But it has fallen quite steeply since, in part because of the positioning on two major issues. The first being the two-child benefit cap, not scrapping it, and the second has been scrapping the winter fuel allowance for pensioners and linking it to being in a recipient of pension credits. Those are things which have damaged his popularity. And I think scenting a bit of blood in the water, the lobby, as they do, are like, oh, well, it's time for us to start noticing things. When it comes to not accepting freebies, that would be a really easy win for Starmer. Because again, thinking about how he positioned himself, particularly against Boris Johnson, he was Mr. Rules. He had a little staged photo opportunity in John Lewis looking at some wallpaper during the refurb crisis of a couple of years ago, when it was felt that Boris Johnson unfairly maligned John Lewis by going for the expensive Lulu Little wallpaper instead. Keir Starmer could very easily be like, okay, well, here is a cheap, indeed free way of me distinguishing myself from the Conservative Party on sleaze. I'm just not going to accept the freebies. Right? Or I'm not going to accept many freebies. Maybe the odd Premier League match, or if England are in the final for something. But other than that, I'm not going to do it. And that would be a really easy dividing line, because he's not that different from the Conservatives when it comes to tax and spend and all sorts of foreign policy decisions. This would be a cheap and easy way to do it. But there is an element of greed and, dare I say it, status obsession with Mr. Starmer. I think that he likes feeling important, and I think that he likes feeling fawned over. And I think that there is something about that, wanting to look a bit fancy and rub shoulders with the great and the good. I wonder if there's an element of that with him. He does seem to really enjoy signifiers of status.
Man has got a big puffed up ego. Which is funny, because there was an attempt sort of at the beginning to say he's very grey, he's a bureaucrat, he's not doing this for himself or ego, he's doing this because he really wants the rules to be followed. I was sort of painting him as this really boring lawyer. But actually the dude, in a way, is like a baller, right? He wants to have a really good time, he wants to dress well. When you say the great and the good, Ash, I assume you're including Georgia Meloni, because that's who he's been lavishing praise on today. Ash, it's been a pleasure speaking this evening. We've got through so much. So yeah, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, where's my Novara Media clothes budget?
There has been discussions about a Novara Media clothes budget for a number of years, but nothing has ever come to fruition. Unfortunately, as you can tell. This is not bad, actually. Uniqlo, I think. Thanks, everyone, for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.